before history was written into books, before events were compressed into dates and timelines, before human memory was filtered through institutions and authority. There was another way history existed. It lived in stories, in symbols, in myths passed from mouth to mouth, generation after generation. And in those stories, again and again, across cultures that never met, the same figures appear. They are always described as larger than ordinary humans, stronger, longer lived, closer to the forces of nature. They are not gods. They are not animals. They are something in between. Today we call them giants. But to the ancient world, they were simply those who came before. Long before modern humans believed they were the center of creation, many traditions suggested something unsettling. Humanity was not the first intelligent presence on Earth. In Mesopotamian texts, early kings ruled for impossibly long lifespans. In biblical tradition, the Nephilim walked the earth before the flood. In Greek mythology, the Titans ruled before the Olympian gods. In Norse legend, the Jotnar existed before the ordered world of men. Different names, different lands, yet the same pattern. Each culture speaks of a previous age, an age that ended in destruction, after which a smaller, weaker humanity inherited the earth. This raises a disturbing question. Why would civilizations separated by oceans remember the same type of beings and the same type of collapse? Ancient people did not see giants as fantasy. They saw them as ancestral memory. Many oral traditions describe giants as builders of the first cities, shapers of mountains and rivers, guardians of sacred knowledge, beings deeply connected to earth and sky. In these stories, giants were not chaotic monsters. They were part of an older order, and crucially, they existed before history resets. Modern thinking often assumes myths are invented to explain ignorance. But ancient societies did not separate myth, history, and science. To them, myth was memory encoded in symbolism. When ancient texts speak of giants moving mountains, they may not mean brute force. They may mean geological knowledge, engineering beyond our understanding, or a scale of existence no longer accessible to us. Over time, symbolism becomes literal. Literal meaning becomes distorted. And eventually, the story is dismissed entirely. But what if these stories were never meant to be taken literally, nor dismissed? What if they were meant to be remembered? This brings us to a forgotten concept in ancient thought. Many cultures believed history moved in cycles. An age rises, an age peaks, an age collapses, then a new one begins. The giants are almost always placed in earlier cycles, not in our time, not in recorded history, but before the current order of the world. According to some ancient traditions, humanity today is living in a post-collapse age, an age where knowledge is fragmented, memory is incomplete, and the past is seen as primitive. But the giants belonged to a pre-collapse world, a world where scale was different, time was perceived differently, and harmony with nature was prioritized. This may explain why giants are often portrayed as morally ambiguous. Not evil, not perfect, but incompatible with the world that came after. As the ancient world shifted, stories were rewritten. Giants became enemies of gods. Giants became demons. Giants became mistakes. Why? Because remembering a world before ours threatens the idea that this world is the best possible one. This is where Tartaria begins to appear, not as a myth, but as a shadow on the edge of recorded history, a name that appears suddenly on maps, a region described vaguely, a land too large, too undefined, too quiet, almost as if it belonged to a time that no longer fit the new narrative. If the giants were real, they did not disappear overnight. They faded. They retreated. They were buried under new stories, new authorities, new versions of the past. And Tartaria may be one of the last echoes of that forgotten world. But before we explore Tartaria itself, we must understand one thing clearly. History does not only forget. History is edited. And the larger the truth, the more violently it is reshaped. For most people today, the word Tartaria means nothing. It is not taught in schools. It does not appear in modern atlases. It is rarely mentioned outside of obscure forums, old books, and forgotten maps. And yet, for several centuries, Tartaria was one of the most widely labeled regions on Earth. A land so vast that it stretched across continents. A name so common that European cartographers repeated it without question. A civilization so quiet in historical records that its absence becomes impossible to ignore. This is not the story of a hidden city. This is the story of a missing world. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, maps from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East consistently labeled an enormous territory as Tartaria. Not a kingdom, not a tribe, not a vague wilderness, but a named land. Sometimes it appeared as Great Tartary, sometimes as independent Tartaria, sometimes divided into regions. Siberian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Little Tartary, Mongol Tartary. The borders shifted, but the name remained. From Eastern Europe to the edge of China, from the Arctic regions to Central Asia, Tartaria was everywhere. And then, suddenly, it vanished. Modern historians often explain Tartaria away as a misunderstanding. They say it was merely a loose European term for nomadic peoples, a label for lands Europeans did not fully understand, a linguistic error based on the word Tatar. But this explanation raises serious problems, because Tartaria was not drawn like an unknown wilderness. It was drawn with borders, with cities, with political divisions, with internal regions. Cartographers did not casually label half the world by mistake. Maps were power. Maps were intelligence. Maps were expensive. And they were corrected constantly. If Tartaria never existed as a real entity, why did it exist so clearly on so many maps? And more importantly, why was it removed so completely? One of the most unsettling aspects of Tartaria is not what we find, but what we do not. There are no long wars described against Tartaria, no dramatic conquest narratives, no single moment of collapse recorded in mainstream history. Instead, Tartaria simply fades, as if it dissolved without resistance, or it was absorbed quietly, or its identity was deliberately erased. This is not how empires disappear. Rome fell loudly. Egypt left monuments and inscriptions. The Maya left ruins and calendars. But Tartaria, maps stop mentioning it. Texts stop explaining it. And modern history moves on as if it was never there. This type of disappearance suggests something unusual. Either Tartaria was never a conventional empire, or Tartaria did not fall, it was redefined. Another anomaly lies in Tartaria's structure. There is no universally agreed upon capital city of Tartaria. This confuses historians, because modern civilizations are centralized. But ancient civilizations were not always structured this way. Some operated as networks rather than hierarchies, cultural spheres rather than nation-states, civilizations defined by shared knowledge, not borders. If Tartaria functioned differently, then modern historical tools would struggle to classify it. And what cannot be classified is often dismissed. What if Tartaria was not a single government? What if it was a civilizational system, a shared technological culture, a way of living spread across vast lands, a civilization without kings as we define them, without flags as we expect them, without borders enforced by walls and armies? Such a civilization would leave a different kind of trace. Across regions once labeled Tartaria, we find architecture that does not easily fit into modern historical timelines. Buildings that appear suddenly fully formed, use techniques difficult to replicate even today, are attributed to unknown builders, or credited vaguely to earlier cultures. Many of these structures are later repurposed. They become churches, government buildings, fortresses, palaces, their original purpose forgotten, or never recorded. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Tartaria was not primitive? What if it was advanced in ways we no longer recognize as technology? Modern people associate technology with engines, electronics, industry. But ancient civilizations approached technology differently. They focused on geometry, acoustics, resonance, earth energies, natural materials aligned with natural forces. If Tartarian knowledge was based on sound, frequency, magnetism, atmospheric interaction, then much of their technology would leave no obvious mechanical remains. And without machines to point to, later historians would conclude they had nothing. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence may not look like what we expect. Now we return to the giants. Why are giants so often associated with Tartaria? In old illustrations and speculative accounts, Tartarian lands are sometimes described as home to exceptionally tall people, strong-bodied humans, long-lived clans, not monsters, not fantasy creatures, but humans of different proportions. If giants existed, they would not need to be hundreds of feet tall. Even a consistent average height of 8 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet would radically change. Architecture, tools, living spaces. Doors would be taller. Steps would be broader. Ceilings would be higher. And strangely enough, many ancient structures reflect exactly that. Could Tartaria have been a civilization built by and for beings larger than modern humans? Or a civilization where giants and humans coexisted? Or perhaps a civilization that preserved giant knowledge long after giants themselves faded? As the modern world formed, new systems of control emerged. Nation-states, centralized religion, industrial economics, standardized education. These systems require clear timelines, clear origins, clear authority. A civilization like Tartaria, vast, undefined, decentralized, technologically ambiguous, does not fit neatly into this framework. And what does not fit becomes dangerous. If Tartaria represented an alternative way of organizing society, knowledge that bypassed modern power structures, a memory of giants who preceded modern humanity, then erasing Tartaria would not be an accident. It would be necessary. Notice what replaces Tartaria on maps. Instead of a civilization, we see uninhabited regions, nomadic territories, wilderness, as if millions of people simply vanished, as if cities never existed, as if history reset and began again from a lower point. This pattern repeats throughout history. After collapses, knowledge is lost. Survivors rebuild with fragments. The past is simplified, and eventually, the old world becomes myth. Perhaps Tartaria was not erased because it was evil. Perhaps it was erased because it was too large, too old, too complex, too different. A reminder that human history is not a straight line upward, but a cycle of rise, loss, and reinvention. And if Tartaria belonged to a previous cycle, then remembering it would challenge one fundamental belief, that we are the most advanced civilization to ever exist. But Tartaria whispers something else, that before our age, there was another, one where giants may have walked alongside humans, one where technology worked with nature, not against it, one where civilization did not require domination to exist. And when that world fell, its name was quietly removed. Walk through the old cities of the world, and something feels wrong. The streets make sense. The materials make sense. The age, more or less, makes sense. But the scale does not. Doors are too tall. Windows are placed too high. Staircases are too wide and too shallow. Ceilings soar far above what comfort requires. These are not isolated examples. They appear across continents, across cultures, across regions once marked as Tartaria. And the more carefully one looks, the harder it becomes to dismiss the pattern. Modern architecture is built around the human body. Every measurement assumes a certain height, a certain reach, a certain weight. But many old structures seem built around different proportions. Proportions that do not match us. In countless historical buildings, we find doors that would dwarf a modern person. Not ceremonial gates, not symbolic arches, ordinary doors. Doors that suggest daily use by someone taller, broader, stronger. Historians often explain this away as grand design or aesthetic choice. But aesthetics usually serve function. A door is meant to be used. Why build thousands of impractically large doors across different civilizations if no one needed them? The same question applies to windows. Many ancient windows are too high to look out of, too large to insulate efficiently, too heavy to be practical, unless the beings inside were taller, or unless the building was not designed for the occupants we see today. Floors, too, raise questions. In many old structures, especially repurposed ones, modern floors sit above older floors, sometimes 1 meter higher, sometimes more, as if the original floor was buried, as if the building sank, or as if something forced the level of living upward. This pattern appears again and again, not as isolated renovation, but as a global phenomenon. Mainstream history often attributes this to floods, renovations, urban development, but the consistency is unsettling. Why would cities across the world raise their floors in roughly the same historical periods? Why do so many ancient entrances now sit below ground level? And why do official explanations rarely connect these dots? Another anomaly appears in construction quality. Many ancient buildings use massive stone blocks, precision cutting, perfect alignment, without evidence of the tools we would expect. No machinery marks, no transitional experiments, no gradual learning curve. The structures appear fully realized, as if the builders already knew exactly what they were doing. We are told they built this by hand. But hand tools leave signatures, and in many cases, those signatures are missing. Instead, we see perfectly smooth surfaces, tight tolerances, advanced geometry, geometry that suggests mathematical knowledge far beyond what is officially attributed to the time. These buildings are often older than the civilizations credited with them. When that becomes obvious, history labels them as built on older foundations, inherited structures, unknown origin, and then moves on. What is rarely asked is, who built the originals? And why do later civilizations consistently reuse them, instead of replicating them? Reuse suggests inability. If a culture could build such structures itself, it would. Instead, we see something else. Later societies occupy these buildings, modify them, divide their spaces, lower their ceilings, shrink them, as if adapting them to smaller bodies. This adaptation is visible everywhere. Large halls become multiple rooms. Tall doorways are narrowed. Grand spaces are enclosed, not for aesthetics, for practicality. If giants existed, their architecture would not look alien. It would look exactly like this. Familiar, but slightly off. Another overlooked aspect is acoustics. Many ancient structures exhibit extraordinary sound properties. Whispers carry across vast spaces. Echoes behave predictably. Vibrations resonate in stone. These are not accidents. Acoustic design requires intention, and intention implies knowledge. Sound has power. Ancient cultures understood this. Sound can heal, coordinate labor, influence emotion, affect physical matter. If Tartarian builders used sound as part of their technology, their architecture would reflect it, and it does. Now consider energy. Before modern electricity, buildings were designed to interact with their environment: sun, wind, earth. Many old structures align precisely with cardinal directions, solar events, seasonal changes. This alignment is not symbolic. It is functional. It regulates temperature, light, and airflow. A passive system, efficient and enduring. If Tartaria was a civilization that worked with nature, its architecture would not dominate the landscape. It would integrate with it. And once again, this matches what we find. The question then becomes unavoidable. If these buildings were not designed for modern humans, then for whom were they designed? One possibility is simple. They were designed for larger humans, not mythical monsters, not fantasy creatures, but beings with greater height, greater strength, greater endurance. Beings whose physicality matched the scale of the structures. Another possibility is more unsettling: that these structures were built during a time when the environment itself was different. Higher atmospheric pressure, greater oxygen concentration, different gravity conditions. In such an environment, life grows larger. This is not speculation. It is observable in the fossil record. If giants were a natural result of earlier Earth conditions, their architecture would not seem excessive. It would be normal. And when conditions changed, the giants would disappear, leaving behind a world built for a scale that no longer exists. Now consider this. Why are so many of these buildings labeled as religious? Cathedrals, temples, sacred halls. Religion is often used as a placeholder when function is unknown. But what if these were not places of worship? What if they were centers of learning, hubs of energy, community spaces, administrative centers, rebranded over time because their original purpose was lost? If Tartaria collapsed, and survivors no longer understood these structures, they would reinterpret them through myth, through religion, through symbolism. That is how knowledge survives collapse, by changing its language over centuries. The builders fade into legend. Giants become myths. Technology becomes magic. Architecture becomes sacred. And eventually, history erases the builders entirely. But stone remembers. Stone does not lie. It does not care about timelines or narratives. It simply stands. And what it shows us is this. These buildings were not mistakes. They were not decorative excess. They were designed for a world that no longer exists. A world where scale was different. Where humans were not alone in their size. Where civilization did not measure itself by dominance, but by harmony. If Tartaria was real, its architecture is the strongest evidence it ever existed, not because we can prove who built it, but because we cannot explain it away. And this leads to the most difficult question of all. If such a civilization existed, why are we never told about it? That question brings us to what Tartaria truly was. Not just a land, not just a culture, but a system of knowledge. And to understand that, we must look beyond stone and scale. We must look at how Tartaria may have lived. To understand Tartaria, we must abandon a modern assumption that advanced civilizations are defined by conquest. Empires rise, we are told, because they dominate. They expand through war. They control through force. They impose order from the top down. But Tartaria does not leave behind the fingerprints of domination. No long lists of conquered enemies. No endless battle chronicles. No monuments celebrating mass destruction. Instead, what we see suggests something else entirely. A civilization organized not around control, but around knowledge. If Tartaria existed as a vast, connected world, it could not have been ruled like a modern empire. The distances were too great, the terrain too diverse, the cultures too varied. Control through violence would have fractured it. Yet the name Tartaria appears consistently, suggesting unity without rigid centralization. This implies a different structure. Imagine a civilization held together not by armies, but by shared understanding, shared principles, shared methods, shared ways of interacting with the natural world. Such a civilization would not need constant enforcement. It would be self-regulating. This brings us to Tartarian technology. Not machines, not factories, not industrial systems, but something more subtle. Technology at its core is the application of knowledge to shape reality. Modern technology uses force. Ancient technology used alignment. Across the lands once labeled Tartaria, we find repeated patterns. Buildings aligned with solar cycles. Cities oriented toward magnetic north. Structures positioned along ley-like paths. These are not artistic coincidences. They reflect an understanding of Earth as a living system. If Tartarian civilization understood atmospheric electricity, natural resonance, Earth's magnetic fields, then their technology would leave few mechanical traces, because it would not rely on machines. It would rely on placement, proportion, and material. Stone, when cut and arranged correctly, can conduct vibration. Metal, when shaped properly, can interact with magnetic forces. Air, when moved through certain forms, can amplify sound and energy. This is not speculation. It is physics. A civilization that mastered these principles would not need smokestacks or engines. Their cities themselves would be devices. This may explain why Tartarian architecture feels alive, why it seems designed not just to shelter, but to interact, why certain spaces feel charged, resonant, powerful. Such a system would also change how society functions. If energy is abundant and decentralized, there is no need to hoard it. If food production is stable and aligned with nature, there is no need for constant expansion. If knowledge is shared rather than controlled, power becomes diffuse. Now consider the giants within this system. If giants existed alongside humans, they would not rule simply because of size. Physical dominance does not create stable civilizations. Wisdom does. Ancient stories rarely describe giants as tyrants. Instead, they are teachers, builders, watchers, guardians, beings who understand the world differently, beings closer to natural forces. In many traditions, giants are associated with mountains, storms, and stars. This symbolism suggests connection, not brutality. If Tartarian giants existed, they may have served as engineers of large-scale structures, keepers of astronomical knowledge, stabilizing figures in society. Not kings on thrones, but anchors of civilization. Such beings would shape society by presence alone. Their scale would encourage long-term thinking, patience, responsibility. A giant cannot hide its actions. Visibility demands accountability. This may be why Tartaria left behind so few war records. A society built around visible responsibility does not glorify violence. Now consider education. In a Tartarian system, knowledge would not be abstract. It would be embodied. Geometry learned through construction. Astronomy learned through alignment. Physics learned through sound and structure. Learning would be integrated into daily life, not separated into institutions. This kind of civilization would leave behind skilled populations, durable infrastructure, cultural continuity, but very little centralized documentation, because knowledge would live in practice, not paper, and this becomes a problem for modern historians. History prefers texts. What is not written is assumed not to exist, but Tartaria may have existed beyond text. Now we come to spirituality. Tartarian spirituality does not resemble later organized religion. There are no clear dogmas, no universal commandments, no centralized priesthood. Instead, we find symbols. Symbols repeated across cultures. The tree, the mountain, the star, the circle. These are not gods. They are representations of principles. A civilization aligned with nature does not worship nature. It listens to it. If Tartaria's worldview was based on cycles, balance, and resonance, then spirituality would be experiential, felt, not preached, lived, not enforced. This would make Tartaria incompatible with later power structures. Centralized religion requires hierarchy. It requires obedience. It requires exclusivity. A decentralized spiritual culture cannot be controlled. As new systems emerged, empires, churches, nation-states, Tartaria would become a problem, not because it opposed them militarily, but because it represented an alternative, a memory of a world where power was not concentrated, where giants and humans coexisted, where technology was invisible, where spirituality was natural. Such a memory undermines authority, because it suggests things were once different, and they could be again. This is why Tartaria could not be remembered accurately. It had to be simplified, redefined, then erased. Giants became myths. Technology became superstition. Civilization became wilderness. And over time, even the questions disappeared. But fragments remain. in buildings that do not fit us, in maps that no longer make sense, in legends that refuse to die. Tartaria was not a failed civilization. It was a completed one. And completed systems do not evolve into new orders. They are replaced. The only way to replace such a world is not to destroy it loudly, but to let it fade quietly, to bury it under new stories, to teach new generations that nothing came before them worth remembering, but something did, and its shadow still stretches across the world. Civilizations do not always fall in fire. Sometimes they fall in silence. No final battle, no burning capital, no single date to remember, just a slow disappearance, until one day the world wakes up and no longer remembers what came before. This is how Tartaria ended. If Tartaria was a civilization built on balance rather than domination, its collapse would not look like the collapse of empires we know. There would be no glorious defeat, no conquering army sweeping across the land. Instead, there would be disruption, a break in continuity, a fracture in the systems that held everything together. Every advanced civilization depends on stability, not political stability, but environmental, energetic, and cultural stability. When those foundations shift, even the most harmonious systems fail. Many ancient traditions speak of a great reset, not metaphorical, physical, floods, climate shifts, changes in the sky, changes in the earth itself. These stories appear everywhere. Different names, different symbols, same event. If Tartaria existed across vast territories, it would have been vulnerable to global change. A shift in atmospheric conditions, a disruption in Earth's electromagnetic balance, a catastrophe large enough to affect the entire planet. Such an event would not need to destroy buildings. It would only need to disrupt the systems that made them function. Imagine a civilization whose technology relied on atmospheric electricity, Earth resonance, precise environmental conditions. Now imagine those conditions change. The technology stops working. Not violently. Simply stops. Cities remain standing. Architecture survives. But the knowledge to use it is gone. And without that knowledge, civilization begins to fragment. This is the most dangerous moment in any collapse. Not destruction, but amnesia. As systems fail, people revert to survival. Local communities isolate. Long-distance connections break. What was once a network becomes scattered fragments. If giants existed, this moment would affect them first. Large bodies require more resources, more stability, more environmental consistency. A sudden shift would make survival difficult. Giants would decline in number, retreat to remote areas, or disappear entirely, leaving behind a world built to their scale. Smaller humans would survive, adaptable, numerous, resilient, but they would inherit structures they did not fully understand. This creates a gap between builders and occupants, knowledge and use, purpose and interpretation. And into that gap, new stories emerge. Survivors explain what they cannot understand. Through myth, through religion, through symbolism. Technology becomes magic. Giants become gods or demons. Civilization becomes legend. Over generations, the original meaning fades. Children grow up hearing fragments. Fragments harden into belief. Belief hardens into doctrine. Now enters the second phase of erasure. Not collapse, but reorganization. As populations grow again, New power structures form. Kings, empires, institutions. These systems need legitimacy. They need origin stories. They need to be first. A forgotten advanced civilization is a problem, because it raises questions. Why were they more advanced? Why did they disappear? And why are we not like them? So the past is simplified. Maps are redrawn. Tartaria becomes a vague region, a land of nomads, an empty space, not a civilization. This process does not require conspiracy. It requires convenience. History is written by those who organize society after collapse, and they write history in a way that supports their authority. The quieter Tartaria becomes, the easier it is to build a new narrative, one where progress is linear. Civilization improves over time. The present is superior to the past. A narrative that leaves no room for a lost golden age. Over time, Tartaria stops being discussed, then stops being taught, then stops being remembered. But traces remain. Old maps that do not match new ones. Buildings that do not match their attributed builders. Legends that refuse to align with official timelines. These are the cracks. The final stage of erasure is reinterpretation. Giants are no longer ancestors. They become enemies of gods, symbols of chaos, warnings against pride. Their memory is turned upside down. What once represented wisdom now represents danger. This inversion is powerful because it discourages curiosity. If giants were evil, why investigate them? If Tartaria was primitive, why question its disappearance? Thus, the past is neutralized, not denied, but made irrelevant. Yet erasure is never perfect. Stone endures. Proportions remain. Scale cannot be hidden. A doorway too tall will always ask the same question. A building too advanced will always provoke doubt. A map too detailed will always resist forgetting. And so, Tartaria survives, not as a chapter in history, but as a pressure point, a place where the official story feels thin. If history were complete, Tartaria would not trouble us. But it does, because it suggests something unsettling. That civilization has risen and fallen before. That humanity is not at the peak of a straight line. That knowledge can be lost, not just gained. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that what we call myth is not imagination. It is memory. That survived collapse by changing its language. The fall of Tartaria was not an ending. It was a reset. And resets do not erase everything. They leave remnants, waiting. Today, we live in a world that believes it knows its past. Dates are fixed. Timelines are clean. Progress is assumed. We are taught where civilization began, how it developed, and why it led inevitably to us. And yet, beneath this certainty, something feels incomplete. If Tartaria never existed, it would not continue to appear in old maps. If giants were pure myth, they would not persist across every major culture. If ancient architecture was fully understood, it would not raise the same unanswered questions centuries later. But these questions remain. Quiet, unresolved, persistent. Modern history is built on fragments. Texts that survived, artifacts that were preserved, narratives that aligned with emerging power structures. But survival does not equal completeness. Much of the past was lost, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. In the modern world, history serves a purpose. It defines identity. It justifies authority. It establishes progression. A forgotten advanced civilization does not fit neatly into this framework, because it suggests we are not the first, we are not the most advanced, and we may not be permanent. Tartaria challenges the idea that civilization evolves in a straight line. Instead, it points toward cycles: rise, peak, collapse, rebuilding, each cycle forgetting part of the last. In such a system, modern humanity is not the culmination. It is a phase. The remnants of Tartaria still surround us. In cities where old foundations support modern buildings. In structures whose proportions feel wrong. In legends dismissed as fantasy. In maps quietly archived and forgotten. These remnants do not announce themselves. They wait. Why has Tartaria not been re-examined seriously? Because re-examination carries risk. If Tartaria was real, then the story of human progress must be revised. If giants existed, then human biology has changed more than we admit. If advanced knowledge once existed and was lost, then technological superiority is temporary. These ideas destabilize certainty, and modern systems depend on certainty. Education teaches what can be tested, repeated, standardized. Speculation is discouraged. Anomalies are isolated. Outliers are ignored, not out of malice, but efficiency. Yet history does not progress through efficiency. It progresses through questioning. Tartaria exists in the spaces between disciplines, too historical for myth, too mythological for history, too architectural to ignore, too undocumented to classify, and so it is left alone. Giants, too, remain in this liminal space, neither accepted nor fully denied, their memory fragmented across sacred texts, folklore, oral tradition, art and symbolism, always present, never central. But memory does not require belief to persist. It only requires repetition, and repetition, across time and cultures, suggests origin. The question Tartaria asks is not, was it real? The question is, why are we so certain it was not? Certainty is comfortable. It allows the present to feel complete. But history has never been complete. It has always been a reconstruction, built from what survived. Perhaps Tartaria represents not a lost empire, but a lost way of understanding the world. A way where technology was not loud, where power was not centralized, where giants were not rulers, but participants. If such a world existed, its disappearance would not be dramatic. It would be quiet, because worlds based on balance do not collapse into chaos. They dissolve, and in their place, new systems rise, louder, sharper, more rigid, systems that require clear hierarchies, clear beginnings, clear endings. The modern world is such a system, and within it, Tartaria remains an unresolved variable. Perhaps that is why interest in Tartaria keeps returning. Not because people seek fantasy, but because they sense a gap, a missing chapter, a feeling that something foundational has been overlooked. This series is not here to tell you what to believe. It does not claim final answers. It does not demand agreement. It offers something older than certainty. It offers curiosity. If Tartaria was real, then history is incomplete. If giants existed, then humanity has forgotten part of itself. If advanced knowledge once shaped the world, then loss is as natural as progress. And if all of this is wrong, then asking the questions still matters. Because unquestioned history is not knowledge. It is tradition. The ruins remain. The maps remain. The stories remain. Waiting. Not to be worshipped, not to be feared, but to be remembered.